Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
And welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice, here for Depeche Mode, the podcast. Dave, back on stage, 40 years since the release of Some Great Reward. I'm glad you are with the show once again this week. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com is my email address. If you're enjoying this as a devotee on YouTube, I hope you'll leave a comment. I'll read those back on next week's show. As always, Depeche Mode, the podcast, is brought to you by the science fiction adventure series EMBARK. If you enjoy science fiction, I hope you'll take a moment and check out EMBARK, available on Amazon.com. An exciting mix of Fast and Furious, Star Wars, Ready Player One, and the science fiction adventures of the 70s through the 1990s. Depeche Mode does play a part in the underlying themes of the story, and there also are references, both direct and indirect, to both yours and my favorite band. Go to Amazon.com and search for Jon, Jon Justice, to check out the EMBARK series, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this week's episode. Depeche Mode's Dave gone, and more to perform at Mark Lanegan tribute show in London. Titled Mark Lanegan, A Celebration, the one-off show will celebrate the late singer and songwriter who passed away at the age of 57 in early 2022. The celebration will take place on December 5th on what would have been Mark Lanegan's 60th birthday at London's Roundhouse, which was where he made his final live appearance in the city. Now, Soul Savers will be serving as the house band for the night, with Dave Gahan performing along with Primal Screens, Bobby Gillespie, and a host of other artists performing Lanegan's tunes. Now, I am not familiar with Mark Lanegan's work. I did talk about Dave's cover of one of his songs on a previous episode. But Dave Gahan's inclusion certainly speaks to not only his fandom of Mark Lanegan, but to Dave's own eclectic taste in music. Both he and Martin have that in common. Neither of them have shown much affinity for modern pop music, even as they themselves have been, and were dismissed, had been dismissed early on by the European press as nothing but a group of trite pop stars. They certainly have proven otherwise, but even when you go back to Depeche Mode's earliest days performing in the early 1980s, I mean, they had a rather eclectic taste in music back then. Now, I think at the time it was a little bit more straightforward, but both Dave and Martin, again, their musical tastes are very much off the beaten path. I think the most sort of mainstream, certainly with Martin, that I've ever seen would have been in 101 when they're in Nashville and they're getting cassette tapes of Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison, where's Roy Orbison? Dave singing a Sparks tune while playing the pinball machine in the film as well. But when you look at sort of the bands that they've been inspired by, and certainly what Dave did with Imposter, and the covers that Martin has done, not mainstream by any stretch, and I guess I say that meaning that Depeche Mode is certainly more mainstream for what it's worth when you consider the bands that inspire Dave and Martin, and I just always found that fascinating. It seems to be a common occurrence among artists. That being said, I've always wondered if, Dave and Martin ever listened to more mainstream alternative bands, because even the bands that open for them haven't been that, unless you go back to, say, the, Music for the Masses tour, World Violation tour, and a bit of Devotional. After that, in terms of support acts, they kind of moved away. I was thinking specifically of Electronic and Nights Are Ebb, and the. But I suppose at the time, to a large group of people, those bands would have been considered less than mainstream as well. Whenever I see the anniversary dates for Depeche Mode back catalog or albums, I just feel older and older by the day. Some Great Reward just celebrated its 40th anniversary. And what I've grabbed here is edited down a couple of different articles, and I thought the takes on the album were really interesting, and I wanted to share them with you this week. One is from Albumism and Andy Healy. The other is from an outlet that talks Depeche Mode quite a bit, and that is The Quietus. So I wanted to share with you some of their thoughts on Some Great Reward, and I'll sort of mix in some of my own commentary as I work through this. I want to say this up front, though, and I just want to throw a question out to you. How much does the album artwork impact your listening experience of a particular album by Depeche Mode? And take that however you'd like. I know for me it makes a difference. I mean, I visualize. I'm a very visual person, along with being very, sort of audio-centric. But I'm a very visual person. And I know that when it comes to the albums, I mean, I envision those album covers, and it sets the stage and the vibe for the record in and of itself, almost regardless of what the music is. That changed a bit for me as the band progressed. It kind of stopped with Songs of Faith and Devotion. The inclusion of the band's faces on the album cover, I didn't mind it, but at the same time, I have wondered if the album cover would have been better if it had just been those monolithic symbols that Anton Corbijn had the band go and draw, rather than including their faces on the album cover. I didn't really ever care much for the Ultra album cover. For the longest time, I actually thought it was a brick bridge, a brick bridge over a body of water. It took me a little bit of time before I realized that it was an up-close shot of, I believe, Dave's wrist with a bracelet on it. And while I liked the way the imagery worked in terms of the logo and it being sort of that embossed stamp kind of thing that Anton Corbijn did there, working through the other album covers, they didn't have quite as much of an impact on on the album itself. I certainly do associate and think of like Sounds of the Universe. I thought that album cover was a little bit weak. Wasn't Anton's best work. Playing the Angel was a return to form. I very much enjoyed Exciter. I think I should include Exciter into the mix. I thought that was a very good album cover as well. But I'm just curious how much the album cover actually impacts your view of the album or your enjoyment of the songs. And again, however you want to riff on that, go ahead. I say that because Some Great Reward has that very similar aesthetic to the previous albums when you look at Construction Time Again and A Broken Frame, of the imagery there. And for me personally, that imagery for Some Great Reward is definitely attached to all of those songs on the album. So getting to these articles, though, happy 40th anniversary to Depeche Mode's fourth studio album, Some Great Reward. Originally released September 24th of 1984. There's something to be said about discovering a band on their debut release and following them through the trajectory of their career. What I loved about this article from Albumism is that, and I know this rings true for many of you that listen to the podcast, but this is exactly my experience. Having discovered Depeche Mode prior to hearing Shake the Disease, but really becoming a fan of the band through that song, going out and by default and accident buying Black Celebration first, and then going and getting Some Great Reward and catching up with here in the States. Just like this writer says, I then went back and just got every single piece of Depeche Mode music, import single that I could possibly get my hands on as I awaited the release of Music for the Masses. Now, they found Depeche Mode around Music for the Masses. There is, however, something about finding your way to a band mid-journey and then having the instant gratification of going back to unearth earlier releases that led them to this point. The latter was the case for me discovering Depeche Mode, writes the author. Drawn to the band through their Music for the Masses release, I had the joy of being able to go back and track their journey through the earlier releases. Some of it really hit home for me, the dark and brooding Black Celebration. Others, like Speak and Spell, didn't hold much in common with Depeche Mode that I had been introduced to. Along my journey of Depeche, I landed on their 4th studio album, Some Great Reward. From the urgent propulsion of the opening track, Something to Do, it's evident that the band had something to prove. No longer content just creating catchy electronic angst anthems, they are driven towards colliding industrial rhythms and mechanized sounds without losing sight of the underlying musical sensibilities. It's this clash of the hard and soft, the raw and refined, that permeates its way through the album as Martin Gore explores a sense of social alienation in a highly accessible and relatable way. I'm watching YouTube yesterday, and the algorithm recommended this 10-minute long video, and it was the top 100 synth tracks of all time, clearly curated by whoever created it. But 10 minutes long, 100 synth tracks. They only play a handful of seconds and a snippet of the video attached to each song. And it was such an interesting journey because I realized that my love of synth music, while it is rooted in Depeche Mode, had started with a lot of other bands that I was listening to at an incredibly young age. Talking, 11, 12, and 13 when I started to discover music, and probably paved the way for when I discovered the greatest synth band ever, Depeche Mode. On that list of 100, there were quite a few Depeche Mode tracks, not a huge surprise there, although they put New Order at number 1, and I completely disagreed with that. Be that as it may. It was an interesting little journey back in time, and I'll get personal here for just a moment. 15 years old in 88, that's when I went to go see, would have been turning 16 in July that year, going to the Rose Bowl show. But thinking back on Some Great Reward and finding that album right around that era, probably 14, 15 is when I got Some Great Reward. And again, moving through 13, 14, 15 in puberty, Some Great Reward had a huge impact on a very young, budding Jon, at the time, Lo Giudice, before I adopted my radio name of Jon Justice. And the more sensual aspects of Martin's writing certainly had a major impact on this guy as a kid, finding his own and finding girls and learning about love and lust and sex. That was all. Some Great Reward is sort of the touchstone for me. The article gets into a bit of that. And I will say that this album carries with it one of my favorite all-time Depeche Mode songs, and probably my favorite all-time Depeche Mode love song, and that would be It Doesn't Matter. I just absolutely adore that track. And that's a track that, for me, has carried with me for years and gotten me through many a relationship that didn't go as one would hope. Gore's songwriting throughout Some Great Reward explores the dichotomy of modern life, delving into themes of love, lust, desire, power, manipulation, isolation, intimacy, and searching for belonging, and walking the tightrope between societal and sexual submission and dominance. And for the most part, it's handled with a deft touch, filling tracks with nuanced and introspective moments. Interesting tracks like The Slithering Lie to Me, The Reluctant Love Affair of Stories of Old, layer metallic clangs, distorted synths, and Gahan's increasingly confident vocals to create a sound that is as dark as it is danceable. The bold and confronting master and servant explores power dynamics in and out of the bedroom, bound in a taut industrial beat. I don't know if I've told the story before, but since I'm talking about a young Jon, I'll share it with you now. So going to Arcadia Christian High School. Arcadia Christian School. It was a middle school. Excuse me, I wasn't in high school yet. And I remember having a conversation with one of my classmates, a female. I think her name was Heather, if I'm not mistaken. We were talking about how we both enjoyed Depeche Mode. And through the course of the I think we were passing notes in class, if I remember correctly. I certainly didn't intend for this to happen. In retrospect, now I understand why it was so awkward. But I either said to her or I wrote her a note and said, let's play Master and Servant. And I was just having fun because we both were talking about Depeche Mode. She took it in a more literal way and then didn't talk to me for a little while. Kind of surprised she didn't tell the teacher, to be honest with you. I was pretty naive back then. I'm pretty naive now. It's a prime example. It's getting back to Master and Servant. The bold and confronting Master and Servant, exploring the dynamics in and out of a bedroom bound and a taut industrial beat. Prime example of Depeche Mode's ability to mix the provocative with the palatable, of being challenging while still delivering infectious hooks. The track also highlights the strengthening of Dave Gahan's vocals, which vacillate between commanding and vulnerable, perfectly mirroring the song's exploration of control. Title tracks like People Are People and If You Want demonstrate the increasing incorporation of found sounds sampled and tweaked into the layering of this new soundscape. If You Want is a bag of sampling and sequencing tricks where it feels like every idea and the clonking of a kitchen sink has been thrown at the song amidst all the energy and electronic experimentation. It's the album's quieter moments that some great reward finds its human heart. Somebody strips back the electronics for a simple piano accompaniment, laying bare Gahan's yearning for connection. Vulnerability is on full display as Gore exposes raw personal emotion without trying to bury it beneath layers of electronica and multi-stacked samples. Likewise, It Doesn't Matter, another Gore-led vocal, is open-hearted in its lyrical narrative set against the sprightly electronic pings that intrigue rather than overpower. Some Great Reward is a testament to Depeche Mode's fearless evolution. It's an album where the band found their voice, one unafraid to grapple with uncomfortable truths while wrapping those truths in sounds that compel listeners to lean in, packed with themes that still resonate. It's an album that provides comfort and solace to the listener, making them feel not so alone in the world we live in and life in general. Now, with that, I move over to the Quietus article. 40 years on, Depeche Mode Some Great Reward, revisited. In 1984, George Orwell has Winston Smith overhear one of the anonymous proles sing a song described thus. The tune had been haunting London for weeks past. It was one of countless similar songs published for the benefit of the proles by the subsection of the music department. The words of these songs were composed only without any human intervention whatsoever on an instrument known as a versificator. The only quoted lyrics, it passed like an April die, but a look and a word and the dreams they stirred, but a look and a word and the dreams they stirred, they have stolen my art an a why. The implication is mechanized social control, diversion from truth and reality, silly love songs, and not a little generalized snobbishness. One has to wonder what Orwell might have thought of Depeche Mode in 1984 when Cold War propaganda was still thick in the air. In musical terms, there was a critical environment where too often real instruments were seen as having more validity than anything made with electronics, which was supposedly being MTV pop for the ignorant and fashionistas. In this, Depeche Mode were an all-electronic band with its own songs haunting London and elsewhere, included this as a lyric on its fourth album, following the crisp pulses and hi-hat recreations and snaky bass part and a distorted woodwind feeling of melody. Come on and lie to me. Tell me you love me. Tell me you love me. Say I'm the only one. Further in the song, truth is a word that's lost its meaning. The truth has become merely half true. So lie to me like they do in the factory. Make me think that at the end of the day, some great reward will be coming my way. Ah, yes, the words of Martin Gore taught a very young John about sex. Stepping back, hearing this album fresh for what it was rather than what it further pointed towards turns memories into new appreciations. Because this is one ridiculously rich album. An industrial pop fusion of dreams is shot through with more subtlety than it's given credit for. Sequenced perfectly, and in the end so accomplished that it's no surprise Depeche shifted gears in the end for Black Celebration to create another landmark instead. Depeche's youth really is still the key here. The geeky wannabe flash of Essex kids on the make still there, but just a little older now. Gore's angst dividing into desperation and dreaminess and bitter contempt. Dave Gahan, still years away from singing lessons, but able to use his baritone to match all the appropriate moods, and self-contained boy band playing to its strengths in the most unexpected ways. Alan Wilder was well en route towards being one of the late 80s best pop arrangers, period, while the production team of mute boss Daniel Miller, John Fox assistant Gareth Jones, coming off their fine work on the previous year's Construction Time Again, upped themselves further. And if confidence bred confidence, everyone had to feel pretty well chuffed by the time Some Great Reward came out, thanks to a lead single some months before that had been blown through the ceiling. People Are People, in retrospect, takes a place for Depeche Mode that matches Creep for Radiohead, the breakout hit early on, if a little later for Depeche Mode. The song that established their name well beyond their home country. It went to number 1 in Germany and then became their first top 20 single in America a year later. The song that after a while the bands in question just wanted to ignore and leave behind them, however powerful it was for listeners at the time. In both senses of the word, Depeche Mode haven't played the song since 1988 and are quite content about that. If Some Great Reward had been nothing but a variety of People Are People styled songs after another, it would still be a heck of a shock of the new moment for the time. But thankfully, Depeche had shown, even from the Vince Clarke-led start, that everything from slow ballads to high-speed dancing was on the agenda. Songs like Stories of Old, taking images of courtly love and smashing them out of desperation, and If You Want, my always Into the Weekend tune, Wilder's last major direct songwriting contribution, split the difference between the extremes, a little stronger energy, a little calm. Meanwhile, the opening track, Something to Do, is just another song like People Are People, to a degree with plenty of its own tricks and flips, like the strident electronic bass bit during the breaks, the gurgling burble of an opening sample sounding queasily biologic, the piano underpinning the arrangement for full impact. But Master and Servant twisted everything around again. As direct as People Are People lyrically, but far more sinuous and unsettling in impact. And instead of People Are People, compacted crunch, there's the looser swing at the same velocity, tones setting the stage, screeches ripping across the main melody lines, along with shouts, gentle croonings of "come on," betraying just a little of the nervous, trying too hard figure Gore in particular was at this time with his black leather and fingernail polish. Then again, that nervous, try-hard approach, that was also a part of a big point. Gore's secretly affectionate nature, or at least his all-too-perfect shy boy act, as encapsulated in his singing, with Gahan taking the lead on hyperactive singles becoming more of a crowd-working frontman as he went, Gore's understated approach became perfectly suited as a lead for the ballads and the deep cuts scattered throughout Depeche's time. It Doesn't Matter plays out as a slippery tangle of nervous synth jitters, understated clangs, and calmer melodies on the verses before a lovely glam-derived descend on the chorus. It's a fine moment, but somebody famously or infamously recorded by Gore in the studio without a stitch of clothing on, that's something else. And I personally would prefer It Doesn't Matter over Somebody, but that's just me. A friend once said that he figured every woman in Southern California of a certain age had this song on their all-time favorite Depeche Mode list to this day. Another friend went to the trouble of going down on one knee and singing this song to his girlfriend, a trained singer like himself, in hopes that she would accept his proposal for marriage. And as I've mentioned on the show before, this was the wedding song that my wife walked up to the altar with when we got married. And again, for those that may have missed the story or haven't heard it before, when we chose that song, I had intended the music to be more of the piano of which Martin plays, like the actual instrumentation, rather than a Muzak version that has the instrumentation actually replacing the vocals. When the song was given to a very tiny local group of musicians, all playing with strings, that accounted for the band that played the song, they ended up getting sort of the Muzak version, which was fine in the end. My wife looked absolutely gorgeous, and it was a beautiful rendition, even though I wanted more of just the piano music during the wedding. I was not complaining. Maybe only a few songs later, like Ultra's Home, and especially playing the Angels' Gone song, Precious, the latter a love song to children in a family riven by divorce, reflecting his own then recently failed marriage, has Gore aiming for such emotional nakedness to match the physical and, indeed, getting away with it. Somebody was released as part of a double A side for the album's final single, probably because they wanted to hedge their bets a bit, because Blasphemous Rumors is something else again. It's the album ender and points the way to Black Celebration in more ways than one, lyrically and musically. So, for all that Some Great Reward was the key step for what was to come for Depeche, for all that you could easily hear where Trent Reznor went, whoa, at some point in the mid-'80s, for all the sheer gifts that the band had in abundance kept returning throughout, aided and abetted by the right co-producers and engineers, it wasn't enough for some in the end, whether raucous blowhards or experimental extremists or some other group again. It was too poppy, it was too easy, it was too obvious, it was too silly, it was too electronic, it was too English, and so many kept raging and raging and raging against the band and pointed to an album like this and the lead single like that as an example. But music and art has its own sick sense of humor, and it's clear who all has had laughed last and loudest. You know, Some Great Reward has not made it much into my commentary in the, I don't know how many shows I've done now, of Depeche Mode, the podcast. And that's probably to the album's detriment and my own personal mistake. That album, for me personally, carried a lot more weight in my fandom than I have given it credit for here on the podcast. And when I go back and look at the catalog, that to me was Depeche Mode's Arrival. I like some, and certainly some of the classics that are on Construction Time Again, and for what A Broken Frame would represent in terms of a band in transition with Vince Clarke leaving, Some Great Reward really did announce Depeche Mode's arrival. I think for a lot of people, we found Depeche right around that album cemented with the masterpiece that is and was Music for the Masses, Some Great Reward is the step to the greatness that became that trilogy of albums that I talk about so often, in which case I should really refer to it more as a quadrilogy, because you can't get to Black Celebration, you can't get to Music for the Masses, you can't get to Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion without having Some Great Reward sort of establish that next step. For me, it really is going full circle with my commentary. It is a bit of the album cover that really ties it back to Construction Time Again and almost tethers it there. That's not to say if the album cover had been different, you would have aligned it more towards Black Celebration. But Black Celebration was the leap forward, at least in terms of perception, wherein Some Great Reward, I really think kind of more is the leap forward. It is that bridge between Construction Time Again and what would become of Black Celebration. And I like what the author did here in pointing to Blasphemous Rumors, because I think you could have lifted that song and placed it over there on Black Celebration, and it would have worked if it had been established in that era. And of course, in the middle of all of this and leading into it, you have Shake the Disease, which should have been like properly on an album. I mean, it's one of their greatest songs, and it's so odd that it kind of sits there in this in this sort of void between the records. It doesn't really belong to one album or another, almost as if you needed to do something similar to what happened with Fly on the Windscreen, where you had that kind of off on its own, but the band loved it so much that they ended up, making the final version for Black Celebration. If it hadn't been, you would have had another repeat of what became of Shake the Disease, and I almost feel like it should have been given a proper placement on Some Great Reward. What say you? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Your emails this week, listener feedback. We start with Michael in Melbourne. Checked out the Rate Your Music song list. In general, it's not too bad, going back to last week's episode. Although Cover Me at number 126 was a surprise. Also, I'm not sure if you've listened to it before, but if not, I cannot recommend highly enough checking out the Australian ABC J-Files podcast from last year, which rehashed some of the band's early and only Australian interviews. And thank you so much for sharing that with me, Michael. I hadn't even thought about going and listening to a podcast from down under, but what a brilliant suggestion. I listened to this recently. It reminded me of how the band has always been willing to embrace technology and experimentation. This, in turn, got me thinking again about AI. While the discussion to date is focused on deepfakes or fans using AI to get their DM fix, I was pondering how I would feel if I found out that the band themselves were the ones to use AI in constructing an album or track. What would that mean for me and the magic of DM? Okay, so the Beatles did it, but let's say that Martin and Dave were to use AI in a new track that they themselves constructed. Should they disclose this to the fans? Would it change your view of Memento Mori if it subsequently became known if they had used it? Or would we simply view it as a supporting technology to either be used or ignored, like a new synth or auto-tune? Imagine if they created a song and then ran it through some AI Alan Wilder treatment. Haha, one can dream on. Greetings from Melbourne, Michael. On a first blush, I would treat it as an extension of new technology, with the band ultimately making the decision of what they want to release. I was thinking the other day, again, talking about the YouTube algorithms, and Andrea Fryer and her creation of the Like a Mystery song, which arguably is the best Depeche AI song that's out there. I gave that a listen again the other day, and it just simply blows out of the water any other attempts at Depeche Mode AI that I have heard. I will say that I have not returned to listening to any Depeche Mode AI, always going and opting for the real thing. I was thinking, though, I would love to see another artist cover that like a version song. I mean, like a mystery song that Andrea Fryer made. I almost thought about doing it myself, because you could very easily sort of take the music that's available via that track of what she created and create sort of the soundscapes there. I don't have the greatest singing voice, but I could pull it off if I tried. So maybe time permitting. My wife's been out of town for 2.5 weeks, so I've been exhausted. I barely had time to do the podcast today, and I'm 35 minutes in. Jon Justice, John, friend of mine, writes in, my DM top 50 can change by the day. I'm sure it will be different than most because I love the album tracks sometimes more than the singles. For instance, Some Great Reward, Stories of Old, is my favorite track. Thank you, John. Always great to hear from you, and I hope that you're doing well, my friend. All right, let's move over to... Next, we hear from Jan, who writes, Hi, John. You are a huge inspiration for me when it comes to DM playlists. A few weeks ago, I made a playlist of Depeche tracks by Martin, Dave, and Alan. It showed me that I like none of Martin's solo work. 2 songs. I only accept parts of Dave's music. 5 songs, 3 of them collaborations. And I am a huge fan of early Recoil work, as am I. What I really don't like now is that the latter, Alan's Massive Attackish era, which started with Unsound Methods, and those, for me, decadent moods, were soaked in Songs of Faith and Devotion. And I think that's what I personally don't like. Don't like it on Songs of Faith and Devotion. Interesting discovery. Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time with Unsound Methods, and I haven't gone back to it. I remember enjoying it at the time, probably for the reverse reason, because it had some vibes that were very Songs of Faith and Devotion, but the lack of accessibility in those tracks is probably what I had the most difficulty with. And listen, that rings true for Martin's solo work and a lot of Dave's work. Dave has developed certainly in terms of being a songwriter, but not the strongest ever. And just his arrangements just didn't typically grab me, apart from a few tracks on both Hourglass and Paper Monsters. Well, last week's top 50 theme was a challenge. It's quite difficult to make a proper top 10 list, but it inspired me to make my all-time favorite songs playlist, songs that I never get tired of listening to even after all these years. I could have written something about any one of these 26 songs, but I will narrow it down to just the first 3. Yes, I might actually have a top 3. The Sun and the Rainfall is a clear winner. A perfect representation of the late Brian Griffin's album artwork. What a fine example of multi-sensory art. Oh, and I like that too, because it kind of goes back to what I was alluding to in my rather convoluted question of how does the album artwork impact your opinion of the album? And it took me until 38 minutes into the podcast to where I actually narrowed down what I really meant with that question. So thank you very much for bringing me here. Hey, look at that. For showing me home. Let's see. Getting back to Jan's email. Get the balance right. Electronic music at its best, crowned by a beautiful melody and perfectly balanced choruses. Blue Dress DM songs are mostly dark, and we are all somehow attracted to their signature mood. This song is such a contrast, a source of positive energy. By the way, the playlist is 2 hours and 8 minutes long, and I think it would make a great concert in another life. Cheers, Jan. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jan. Blue Dress is one of my favorites as well. And it's not just the composition of the music in Blue Dress, but being sort of the hopeless romantic that I am, I find that song to be so relatable, at least what I take away with it. Because I always felt that Martin in that song was expressing his love for another, placing the importance of the of the dress itself on that love and lust for another, but also showing his vulnerability and making himself open into, just how easy it was to have her accept those affections. I just thought it was such an oddly sensual love song, and covertly so in the way that he crafted it by using the dress as the entry point. I just always appreciated about that song. David writes in, I received my Spirit 12-inch singles box set today. Gorgeous packaging, as they all have been. And it got me thinking about another metric for ranking Depeche Mode's career. We can easily name our favorite albums, singles, tours, and even remixes. But what about the single packages themselves? Each era has its set of singles, B-sides, live tracks, and mixes, and these packages have their own unique graphic qualities as well as their own story to tell apart from the parent album. So while Black Celebration is far and away my favorite Depeche Mode album, I think other eras have stronger single packages. Consider how we almost get a mini album from the Violator single releases. Personal Jesus, Dangerous, Enjoy the Silence, Policy of Truth, Collide, St. Jarna, I don't know how anybody else pronounces that. That's how I pronounce it. World in My Eyes, Happiest Girl, Sea of Sin. Add the year single Halo and perhaps an acoustic Personal Jesus to the track list, and you almost have the makings of an album that unto itself is pretty formidable, especially considering how popular Dangerous was on its own. I'm surprised the band didn't exploit that on tour. And wouldn't it have made a pretty terrific James Bond theme? Yeah, that's a top-notch song. I think a similar argument could be made for the singles on Ultra. I personally feel that even though I find the album flawed, it boasts the best singles from an era. As a package, though, I think the B-sides efforts are lacking, though there is some nice return to live tracks reminiscent of the 12-inch releases of the early 1980s. And the discussion could go on. Look at the sheer volume of released during the Music for the Masses era. Strange Love through Route 66. 6 or 7 if you include 101's Everything Counts. And I wouldn't begrudge you for including Only When I Lose Myself and Surrender in that mix of Ultra, since they were very, very closely aligned with that era. And I think the same production team, if my memory serves me correctly. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this topic and those from other fellow devotees. Keep it up, a la mode, your pal David. Thank you, David. And lastly, we hear from friend of the show, Steve Lank, who writes, thanks for another great podcast. I, too, had never heard of Rate Your Music before that you spoke on the last podcast. It took a little... I took a look at the all-time list for singles and was surprised and delighted to see Enjoy the Silence at number 34. Great, although let's see where the second most popular DM song is, so I kept scrolling and scrolling and eventually came to Never Let Me Down Again at 593. To be honest, I lost the will to do any more searching at this point to find number 3. I don't blame you. Keep up the good work, John. It's much appreciated. Your friend of the show, Steve Lank. Thank you very much, Steve, and to everybody who, once again, wrote in this week. Speaking of singles, eras, and B-sides, when are we going to get those 4 fully produced Memento Mori tracks? Your guess is as good as mine. Thank you so much for checking out the episode again this week. As always, if you like science fiction, I hope you'll take a moment and support the My Nerd World podcast and check out my science fiction series, EMBARK. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with sci-fi. Set in the future, 2172, air and space flight culture has replaced car culture. It is inspired in part by DM, life in the so-called space age, love, lust, the world we live in, and life in general. The stories are written for adults, but completely appropriate for children 11 and older, despite my comment a moment ago. The main character of the story, Taft Guardia, is himself a massive Depeche Mode fan at a time when the music of the 80s through the 2000s is nostalgic for the characters in the story, popular among those characters. They feature references to Depeche Mode both indirect and direct while telling an exciting science fiction adventure story. After Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft, Katha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. Buy EMBARK Book 1 today. Head on over to Amazon.com. 7 books in all in the series. Available in hardcover, paperback, audiobook, Kindle Unlimited, and ebook on Amazon.com. Wherever you happen to be listening to this show at in the world. It's available in all various countries. Thank you so much for hanging out once again this week. I look forward to hearing from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. And as always, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, you're safe. Mode on, devotees. And I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore.